we went into sub-object mode and look at the control points now, you can see it has a lot of control points. But these control points on a patch. So actually converting from an editable mesh into an editable patch doesn't really make that much sense. It's much better to do so when it's still a primitive object, as it maintains that implicit surface characteristics that I had when it was a primitive object. So even though you can actually convert between different geometry types, in some cases it actually doesn't really make that much sense. As I said, if you convert a very dense poly mesh into a patch model, you're going to end up with a patch model that doesn't really take advantage of the patch methodology of modeling. So it's really that useful in that kind of circumstance. It's much better to start with a very basic primitive object, convert to a patch, and then build on that. Now, up until this point, the conversions that we've discussed here have all been one-off affairs. We take our teapot and convert it into an editable mesh model, and from there on we cannot go back. Of course, 3ds Max would not be a very procedural system if this could not be done as a procedural operation, and this is indeed very much possible. To do so, you simply place an edit modifier of the relevant type into the stack of your object, and at that point the object passed to that modifier is converted to the base geotype of that type. So as an example, if we take our primitive teapot, we can actually copy it here, and I'll just do that again. And if I wanted it to be an editable mesh, but in a procedural way, I don't have to collapse it. I can actually go up here and I can go edit mesh, click on that, and from this point on it's actually an editable mesh, and I can go in and I can modify those vertices and so on, all the things you would normally do with an editable mesh. I can do the same thing here for an editable poly. I'll just go in and convert that. Got the same deal. We can go in, we can move vertices around, we can select faces, we can delete those faces and so on. I'll just copy this once more here, and again here. I'll just get rid of that editable poly modifier in each case. What else do we have as an option? We've got edit patch, and as I said earlier, that's turned into a very dense patch based model, which doesn't really make that much sense really. So as you can see, in most cases you can actually convert into another piece of geometry, but you can see with the NURBS based objects you actually have to use the right click menu to convert it to a NURBS object. You can't actually do it on the fly. This kind of workflow is very flexible. It means that you can either make an object explicitly become a new object type by using the right click menu and converting it, or you can actually convert it into another type of geometry at any point in its stack by adding an edit modifier of the relevant type. Now, as I described earlier, you can actually get an idea of this in action, because as you can see, this mesh is rather dense, and I'm just going to get rid of this edit patch, and I'll just put it on again just to make sure it's back in its edit patch, there we go, just to make sure it's in its default configuration. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down in the stack to here, and I'm going to change the segmentation values, and then I'm going to go back up, and as you can see now I've got a much lighter patch model, but you can still see it's not really that useful because it hasn't preserved that underlying mathematical curved surface that we had earlier. So you can see that if you want to convert a patch, an object into a patch in the way that we described earlier, so it maintains that sort of implicit surface, you really need to do it by having a primitive object, as you can see here, right clicking and doing convert to editable patch. There we are, and as you can see, that surface then gets converted across. Also, it's a really good idea to bear in mind that even though it may not be spelled out, it's also the case that applying quite a few modifiers actually converts your object to a specific base object type at that point in the stack. This is simply because the modifier can only work on that geometry type and that geometry type alone. And the most common geotype that modifiers require is the original editable mesh geometry type. And so you will find that many of the modifiers will actually convert an object to an editable mesh base geo before carrying out their modifications. This is something to bear in mind when working with NURB or patch surfaces, as it's easy to forget that this conversion can actually have been carried out by one of your modifiers in your stack transparently. And then you find out that your object actually, at that point in the stack, above that conversion, isn't actually a NURB or a patch object as you expected them to be. So, as you can see, we can actually have a number of base object types, and these are then used as the basis for the stack, which then comes after them and applies their modifications. And you can also see from this chapter that these base object types can actually be converted on the fly by adding these edit modifiers into your stack, which will actually convert the object to, say, an edit mesh at that point, or to an edit poly at that point, and so on and so on and so on. So you can convert freely between these base object types by using modifiers, and that allows you to get a much more procedural workflow when you're building up your stacks. Okay, now that we've covered the base object types, let's move on now and actually have a look at how we can work with the stack.